Good morning. Welcome to the Housing Digital Micro Conference. Today we're focusing on preparations for the Renters' Rights Bill and the implications for social landlords. My name's Joe Broon. I'm the Managing Director of Housing Digital and today's host. Today's event will look at new legislation which reshapes the affordable housing landscape. We'll be looking at the crucial insights from social housing providers and hear from industry leaders as we take a bit of a deep dive into the Renters' Rights Bill. And it brings us on nicely to our second keynote speaker. Before we pick up that conversation for the social housing sector with Rebecca, we do have the perspective from the private sector. I'd like to welcome our second keynote of today's micro conference, which is Osai Joseph. Osai is the Regional Engagement Executive for the National Residential Landlords Association. Osai, please feel free to take over the screen with your presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I am the Regional Engagement Executive for the NRLA. We underwent a consultation last summer, sort of replacing some of the regional reps. I'm not sure what sort of previous relationships some of you may have had, but they have been somewhat replaced by full-time staff, including myself. I'm one of four. My colleague James Gladwin, we cover the south of England, so that's anywhere between Cornwall to Kent, Cambridge to the coast, and up to Gloucestershire in West England. So quite a wide remit. If any of you here are local authorities that fall within that sort of range, I'll be happy to have a discussion because either one or two of us would be potentially liaising with yourselves in the future going forwards. And yeah, as Joe has said, this is going to be more of our perspective in terms of the changes and what we expect to see going forwards. I'm going to touch on two issues, mainly from a tenant perspective and then from a landlord perspective, on what what to expect and what changes you'd probably want to think about before it goes through commencement. So I just want to provide a very brief snapshot of the PRS at the moment and the contributions that are being made to it on a whole here. So the GDV is about 45 billion to the UK economy, and that's almost 400,000 jobs. So this is why it's so important from our perspective, because it's such a big contribution that is made, and the number of tenants that that the PRS actually provides for is into the millions. So we can see the importance of making sure that as we go forwards, that the PRS is upheld to a good standard and that everybody's providing good homes because so many people are relying on it. But in light of that, in light of the changes that are to come, some of our landlords do feel that there's going to be a bit too much red tape for them and that they may want to reduce their portfolios. And we've seen that sort of information come back from some of the surveys and everything that we have published. But as an organization, we continue to do as much as we possibly can to make sure that we assist in the PRS sector to make sure that as many of our landlords stay because of the contribution that they make, as I mentioned. But just moving very briefly forwards, there is some adjustments to be made here in terms of the timescales. We've now got a committee date, I think the third week of April. Royal Ascension is going to be after that. So I think initially in the winter, at the start of this year, we anticipated commencement for around July, but that's looking more like October or so now. But again, developments to be made. But this is the sort of timescale that we've been working on. Now, in terms of benefits for residents in the private rental sector, we've seen that there's going to be greater flexibility for tenants going forwards. This is going to mean that they can impose their rights on the home standards, because what we want to do as an organization is make sure we represent the good landlords and good practice. So anybody who is rogue, anybody who's not maintaining their properties to a high enough standard, we generally don't want those people, sort of to remain in the industry, because that is a disservice to the tenants that are coming in. And the new standards will allow tenants greater flexibilities there to, to flag up with their local authority to say that their landlord is not keeping up to, maintaining the property to the correct standard, which leads on to the sort of the second point here. And in terms of the standards, there should be, well, the analogy that a rising tide raises all the boats. As the new bill goes through, the the standards that are going to be imposed should mean that the property standards are generally uplifted across the board. So where we're experiencing issues like damp and mold guidance or AWAB and things of such nature, that should, in theory, be minimized by the increase in standards, the fines that are potentially going to be levied for, gross misconduct or repeat offences going forwards. There should also be a standardized experience here as well. So with the introduction of the database, there should be a certain amount of information related to the property that the tenant wants to rent out. Though all the details are not released at the moment, the things like property compliances should be on there. Um, whether things like gas safeties have to be up there and EICRs and everything else should be able to give the tenant a snapshot of that property from a distance to see that that particular unit they're going after is up to a good standard. In terms of banning discrimination, so we want tenants that are on, in receipt of benefits, um, those that may have, multiple kids or pets, for example, should be given a fair shot. So whether a landlord is self-managing, whether they are using an agent, everybody's going to have to be held to a standard here to make sure that no discrimination occurs and that everybody has a fair opportunity um, at that particular property as well. And then in terms of the legal requirements, as I mentioned before, the database will be imposing a lot of this, but you think about HHSRS, the damp and mold guidance that's going to come in. Um, the legislation here should improve all the standards for the tenants and make their rental experience a lot better. But the reason I've got balance here at the bottom of the page is because we have seen the research that's come from Wales and Scotland in terms of the changes that they've made to some of their legislation. And what we've actually noticed is that because of the increased administrative burden, I dare say, on landlords after new legislation comes in, that some of them then do decide to leave the sector. And in Scotland, in particular, we saw a 10% decrease in the PRS. Now, this actually puts a bit more pressure on the tenants because now there's less homes for them to go after, and that could potentially increase the competition that they then face. So there is a balance to this. We want to increase the standards. We want to make sure that the homes that are being offered to tenants are good and are great, but on the flip side, we don't want to see a reduction of the stock either because of the increased competition and what that could mean for those who are also maybe struggling with affordability. Will they potentially fall into the social sector now because landlords are going to be more risk averse? And these are some of the questions that we are trying to address as we work through this bill. Also, so for best practices for landlords, our message is to encourage all landlords to be a part of a landlord association. It doesn't have to be ours. We do just happen to be the largest one in the country, but if you've got a more local one, that is fine. But we do encourage a membership to a landlord association because of the support that can be provided there. I'll be touching on what we provide a little bit later for those that don't know. But as also general guidance, we encourage our landlords to now look at their referencing procedures to make sure that this is a lot more stringent. In terms of inspections, we have encouraged our landlords to do more thorough pre, during, and post tenancy inspections. They're going to need to keep an eye on things like ventilation, structural issues that lead to damp and mold, but also making sure that the property is as efficient as possible for the tenants that are moving in. In terms of compliances, the legal documentation that's then going to be required for them to upload to the database. Um, they're going to have to make sure that they're on top of this. They won't be able to rent out their property without, any reprisals in terms of fines, as I mentioned previously. Insurance documents. So with things like pet clauses, the fact that this bill will supersede some mortgage clauses as well needs to also be considered for landlords going forwards. Rent reviews and their marketing. So whether you self-let or you use an agent, this is a conversation that you're going to have, and to make sure that your property is at fair market rate, but also to factor in the costs of your um, of of the rental amount that you're are wishing to maintain because of the increased administrative costs that may come along with this. So there is a sort of a balancing act that needs to be looked at here, but these are all the things that we are, communicating to our landlords, and also the potential to work with the local authority as well. Some local authorities do provide a mediation service. So let's say some of your tenants might, maybe they lose work and they're in receipt of benefits now. Can the local authority bridge the gap between, the rate that they can pay and the rate that's being asked for? So these are all conversations that are going to potentially need to happen. Just as a quick snapshot as an organization, I just wanted to highlight the the documents and guides on the bottom left of the page. We do have a plethora of these, and they are resources that can be used by not just our landlords, but our business members, also by estate agents and local authorities as well. And you can see that there's over 100,000 calls to device line last year. About 30% of those do actually come from those three and not just our landlords. So we are an organization here to help everybody that does need it. And then lastly, these are the joining options. I won't dwell on this for too long, but as a special thank you to anyone turning up here, if you are a private landlord or you are a social landlord and you think, you know what, I may want to join a landlord association, I do have a discount code here, LJ15. These are the prices, but I'll just whiz back to the start of the presentation. There's my email in case anybody wants to reach out to me.
Thank you for that presentation, Osai. Interesting to hear the perspective of NRLA. Do we have any questions for Osai, please?
Just a quick question. It was just picking up on the discrimination, ban discrimination. I know we've talked about the pets, and that seems to have made all the news. But could you just explain a little bit more about the discrimination and what's actually been identified that they're going to improve? That'd be great.
So firstly, it's in relation to advertising. Currently, you can't put things like no DSS in your ads and everything else, but it's giving the tenants who are in receipt of benefits, those that might have, children where you feel that you don't want them in your property, a fair opportunity. How this is going to be imposed is actually really where the rubber meets the road, because there is a there is definitely a balance between the theoretical and the practical here. So it's a case of, okay, this is what good practice is, this is what you're meant to do, and this is what we expect you to do. But then how this is actually going to be policed, I use in quotations, is going to be another issue entirely. But what we want to see is a fair opportunity for all. That if there is a single mother, for example, with two kids, that she has a fair opportunity to go to that property. I think this would probably be easier to sort of review through an agency where the advert might be a bit more public. It might be online, for example, and other people have, sort of eyes on it. But in terms of, more private rentals, that might be another issue. But how this is going to be enforced is to be seen.
Sorry, and a bit of a follow-up question as well. You talked about the standardized experience. That's happily answered the discrimination question, by the way. Yeah, I mean, my question was, how's this going to be measured? I mean, I know you just touched on it now. But is there some sort of follow through on this once this act has been passed and things are put in place? What's the follow through after that? Because I think that's the only thing you've not gone forward on.
What we know so far, there is going to be the 12-month secondary amendment. So there are going to be edits, if you will, over the next 12 months whenever this comes in. So if it's October this year, then we've got another year afterwards where there's going to be more of the fine tuning. But at the moment, in answer to your question, it does seem to be quite high level at the moment. So the minutiae is what we're going to have to, I think, wait for, which is maybe not the best of answers, but secondary legislation seems to be where some of those I's will be dotted and T's crossed.
Yeah, that's the impression I got actually as well. But that's it's good to know that things are gonna go and be reviewed in 12 months.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Gillian. We have an outstanding question for Osai. Gillian, have you got that?
Okay, so it was in the chat and it was from Abby, I believe. And basically it was to do with PRS. Does anyone have any insight on what is considered PRS? Question mark. We have IMRs and rent to buy, and although these are affordable products, they seem to be a grey area in terms of are they actually PRS? And I think that's really for Osai. I don't think anyone else can answer
Oh, I think Lachlan did kindly answer that actually, by uh, by stating that I think IMR actually falls under the social spectrum, if I'm correct. Lachlan, you may want to back me on.
Yeah, so I mean, appreciate it's social. That's our private sector is Osai's bag, but this does turn on to legal definitions, and my understanding of the way that's currently supposed to be worded is by effectively saying, well, the private sector is anything that isn't social sector, and so then defines what is the social sector. And so at the minute, it's talking about largely, again, you have to look at each individual part of it because sometimes it talks about low cost accommodation, sometimes about social housing, but broadly speaking, it refers to social housing as being, as we talked before, as defined under the Housing Regeneration Act 2008. And so, as we mentioned before, intermediate IMR is an intermediate market rent, and that is generally considered to be social housing, even if it's got a slightly different regulatory approach. Just by way of context, in terms of the different rental prices you can have, yeah, this, the basic starting point is social rent, and that is the kind of the common and garden social housing tenancy under the rent influence, what used to be rent influencing regime. It's now the rent standard. It's the formula rent. It's the one that's got that horrific calculation to do with weighting, to do with national and regional property prices and rental sort of markets. And that is typically ish around 60 to 70% of a market rent in broad brush terms, but it varies from area to area. Then you've got affordable rent, which is defined as being 80% of a market rent, and that includes service charges. And that was originally designed as a bit of a vehicle for fixed term tenancies under the Localism Act. And being really honest, it was meant to be a bit of a kind of carrot to the social housing sector to adopt fixed term tenancies, as in we will let you charge a little bit more on your rents if you'll consent to using these fixed term tenancies, which the government was trying to introduce and which weren't hugely popular, to be honest. In the end, after the 2015 general election, those two things got decoupled to a large extent, and affordable rent has just been permitted to be used in the social housing sector on a case by case basis. It's becoming increasingly prevalent. It's no longer tied to having to use fixed term tenancies necessarily. Then you've got, but that's still counted as a social rent. Then you've got intermediate rent, which is still in effect 80% of a market rent. So it's very similar to affordable rent, but the difference is that it doesn't fall under the same detailed provisions under the rent standard. It's usually tied in with new build accommodation or very specific, rental to home purchase products or something along that nature. And then lastly, we've got market rent, which is your full fat, same as the private rented sector, just charged wherever the market will stand. I suppose it's also worth briefly mentioning you can still have fair rents in the social housing sector, but they've got their own very quirky regulations as well under the old Rent Act 1977. So, and they will definitely still count as a social housing.
Excellent. Before we move on to our summaries of today's keynotes, have we got any final questions for any of our speakers today? Okay, good stuff. Osai, thank you very much for a very insightful presentation, and certainly lots to think about.
So, to summarise today's presentations,
our first keynote today was from Lachlan McLean, who was a partner at Forbes Solicitors, who got the conference underway with the introduction of the Renters' Right Bill, and provide delegates with an overview of the history and context that has informed the bill's development. The bill is obviously still in draft form, which explains a lot. So it's hard to make definite commitment until it's given firmer form, but we can still get an idea of its implications and potential impact. Much of the bill is focused on the private rented sector, such as Section 21, no-fault evictions, but he mentioned the impact is likely to be more nuanced for social landlords. That said, there is the spectre of the law of unintended consequences to consider. We then heard from Osai Joseph, who's the Regional Engagement Executive for the National Residential Landlords Association. Osai presented the private rented sector's position, offering an overview of both the tenant and landlord perspective. The PRS is an important contributor to the UK economy, he pointed out. New legislation will serve to raise standards across the sector, promoting best practice and also create greater flexibility for tenants and an overall improvement in tenant experience. However, referring to research in Wales and Scotland, he said there is a risk that the added administrative burden of new legislation may lead to private landlords withdrawing from the sector, reducing stock for tenants, so a balance is necessary. And then our final keynote was from Rebecca Brady, who's also a partner for the Devonshire's solicitors, who explores some of the key areas of concern for the social housing sector. As she noted, the Renters' Rights Bill is largely focused on the PRS, so it is certainly more nuanced when it comes to the social housing sector. Social housing is already highly regulated, and for the most part, general needs are unaffected by the potential abolition of Section 21. However, that's not the case for a range of niche products such as rent to buy. Given this, the government recognises the need for new grounds for possession. Rebecca also explored shared ownership in relation to the legislation and explained some of the factors and issues the sector needs to be aware of. For all the complexity of the issue she discussed, Rebecca has no doubt that the sector can adapt and change. It is, after all, adept at changing. So a good final thought there, I think, from Rebecca. All that's left to say is thank you very much for everyone who attended today. Thank you to our keynote speakers. Hope to see you on a future micro conference. And just a final plug for Housing Digital. If you haven't already registered for free membership, please do so. Please do so. I have put a link in the chat. So please enjoy the rest of your Thursday afternoon. Thank you for attending.